thank you, Anthony, for inviting me to participate today. I'm fairly certain that he slotted me in the early afternoon because nothing would keep you in your seats than a discussion about infrastructure. But I think it's a really critical conversation. It's something that's been an undercurrent in some of the conversation that's been taking place today about how we can effectively manage an open access ecosystem in the scholarly publishing environment. So very quickly, how many of you are familiar with NISO? Anyone not that I can pigeonhole in for a drink later? Okay. Wow. The one thing that I'd like to stress, being on this side of the pond, is that despite our name, the National Information Standards Organization, actually about 20% of our members are actually based outside of the US, and we do a lot of work outside of the United States, so we are not, despite our name, strictly focused on US activities, and I think our community is truly a worldwide one. So if you Google an image Google search of infrastructure problems, there is no shortage of images of, streets collapsing, bridges collapsing. Part of this is because people don't like talking about infrastructure. They certainly don't like investing in it. If you approach your CEO and say you want to buy a new circulation management system, I'm sure that's not the thing that they're going to get really excited about in terms of their investment priorities. But it is a critical element of all of the things that we do. We don't think about the bridges until the bridges collapse. We don't think about the water pipes until they don't work. And I think in our environment now, we don't think about many of the things that have been put in place that make our ecosystem function. But open access is going to be challenging that. And I'll give you a couple of reasons for that. And I won't linger on this too much, is the increasing number of mandates. We're now over 600 mandates. This is the Registry of Open Access Repository and Mandatory Archiving Policies, or RORMAP. Last year there was a fairly large announcement from the US government. I think that's creating some significant implications. And this is a graph from work done by Richard Poinder, projecting a kind of hockey stick-like growth of open access. And he projected that somewhere between 2018 and 2024, open access articles would represent more than 50% of all articles published. That is probably a very frightening perspective or consideration for most publishers, not from the perspective of business models. I would say it's a problem from a perspective of infrastructure. We have developed over decades an infrastructure for managing subscriptions. We have agents who manage a lot of these processes for publishers and for libraries. We have an entire system of EDI exchange, Onyx for serials messages, cataloging messages. How do you distribute price information to the community so that they can then, the library community can then purchase those subscriptions, journal selection systems, even systems that I'm sure most publishers don't consider in terms of library management, like cataloging systems and discovery systems and open URL resolver systems, which are all journal-based. They're not article-based. They're all journal-based. Now, certainly there has been significant changes to this environment in the last, say, 15 years or so. One example of that, about 98% of all subscription revenue went through agents in the late 90s. That's down to less than 50% now. I would say that's probably moved to more big deals than it is moved to APCs. But certainly this space is full of infrastructure that we don't think about. This is some information from Publishers Communication Group from a research report that was published just in September. And PCG asked the librarians, who is actually paying APC charges? And granted, it was a fairly small number, but it is spread out throughout the academy. 47% were the authors paying, probably the authors paying through departmental credit cards. The relevant relevant department is occasionally paying. The institutions are paying. I think the libraries are only about 25% of this. So even though there's been some discussion of agents stepping into this space, not a lot of APC money is being processed through the library. This is particularly true in the US because departments are handling it, researchers are handling it, so the agents are not in a position to step into this space realistically. Which leads us to the question, a fairly large question. Journal subscription business is about $4.3 billion according to STM in 2012. I'm fairly certain that universities do not want to be processing $4.5 billion on departmental credit cards. And I'm fairly certain that publishers do not want to process $4.3 billion through credit cards, where they were receiving, say, 4 or 5, 1,000 subscriptions. Multiply that towards how many papers are in those journals, and the significant problems of payments divided by 10 different authors, different PO systems. I mean, we have an entire system that we are going to jettison if we get to a point of the money that supports the publishing industry to distribute content is now going through author payment systems versus subscription systems. So NYSA decided to start somewhere small in looking at some of the open access problems that this has posed. So we focused on this small little question about open access metadata. And we launched a project about 18 months ago called the Open Access Metadata and Indicators Project, OAMI. And we quickly ran into problems with this. Editorially, we weren't able to come up with a good definition of open that everyone agreed with, so we had to strike that. We thought that metadata was redundant with indicators, so we cut out that. And we also are focusing on more than access, we're also focusing on the license information because we're skipping out on open. So we now have the Access and License Indicators Project, or ALI. One of the success vectors for a good standards initiative is a good acronym, so I think we've come up with a decent one. The working group spreads pretty diversely across our community. They worked fairly quickly to get a draft specification out to the community. I think it was 9 months from the time the working group started to the time it got released, a draft released. But it included funding organizations like Welcome, publishers like APCS, repositories like SSRN, the STM Association, metadata repositories, Crossref, CCC. And there's a little caveat here that just because their logos are up here doesn't necessarily mean that they've adopted or agreed with this recommendation yet, since it hasn't been published. They're just participants on the working group. So as I mentioned, open access is a challenging term, at least to develop consensus around. So we tried to focus on rather factual information, specifically what is free to read by anyone on the web? Could they get access to something? And can we provide a minimal set of metadata that would allow this infrastructure to identify those articles, particularly in a hybrid environment? We had initially thought about creating a logo that we could use throughout the internet to highlight this is an open access thing. That was quickly jettisoned by the group. Another significant problem with this, I mentioned we include license information. Encoding licenses is certainly not an easy process. It's actually quite a challenging one. Once you get beyond things like CC licenses. CC licenses are easily represented because they're fairly simple. But once you get beyond, say, CC by SA or NC license, licenses get very complicated very quickly. And we could include a full encoding using something like Onyx for publication licenses. which is an XML structure for encoding licenses, but very few people know how to do that. So rather than including full ONIX information, we decided to head down a different path. I mean, these are just some of the challenges we run into when thinking about a fairly simple structure of two tags. Those two tags are, is this free to read? And the second is, what's the license? So the free to read tag basically indicates whether or not this information can be read without access control. It's a simple attribute, yes, no. And there is a little bit of other information such as optional dates, start, end, to which you might say, put something out into the community for promotional purposes and then pull it back. The license tag is actually a bit of a punt, actually. It's a URI that points to where the license is or where the encoding is. So you have a URL that says, this is where the license is. You can go there for more information. If it's a CC license, obviously that makes things a lot easier, but if it's a much more complicated license, here's the URI, here's the URL where you can go to actually read the license and find out what those rights were, rather than actually encoding what all of that information is. If it has multiple licenses that change over time, say it's initially a restrictive license and then becomes a CC license later, or moves into the public domain later, that can be managed here as well. Another element of this recommended practice is how that metadata should be distributed, who it should be distributed to, aggregators, content providers, discovery systems, etc. Different use cases for the information that we're trying to provide to the community. Focus on three different groups. You've got the users, you've got content providers and aggregators, discovery services, and also the funding community. And just very quickly, some of the potential use cases for the user community. If you've ever searched for Google, searched Google Scholar or Service, you'll never know what is open access unless you click on it and click through and get hit into a subscription wall. Now, if I presume that I don't have a subscription to Nature or the astronomy journals, I won't click through because I presume that I don't have access, even though I do. We also hope that by including license information, we'll maybe push the bar just a tiny little bit further about people's awareness of what people can do with license information. I think a big area, a big win here will be for the aggregators, services like Share and Chorus that are developing that can provide this information and resources to the community and aggregate open access information and share it to the rest of the community. Repositories can use this information to provide services to their university about compliance. And then the funding bodies obviously have an interest in automated ways to ensure that people are complying with the policies that they're putting forward. So as I mentioned, we released this draft for public comment in January, after only 9 months of development. So anybody who thinks that standards have to take 10 years to develop, we're pushing back on that a little bit. And then you say, well, it's 9 months since February, what's been going on? The problem was we got a lot of comments. We had over 120 comments to this public draft, which is about 4 times what we usually receive. And these comments actually were quite interesting in terms of the issues that they raised. Liability and warranty issues. If you are presented with a metadata that says this information is in the public domain or CC by, what if my institution does something with that and it's incorrect? Does the offending institution have any liability there? So questions like that, turn to lawyer, say, lawyer, help us here. That process has taken a little bit longer than we'd expected. But we are just about finished. I was hoping that we'd have this out in November, but everything needs a final editorial pass. I expect this will go forward to the NISO Discovery to Delivery Topic Committee, which has been overseeing the work. They meet next week, and this is on the agenda for vetting and hopefully possible approval. So conceivably by the next week or so, we'll be in a position to make an announcement, although we might hold back on the announcement because the week before Christmas is never a good time to make an announcement. A caveat, NISO has been very reticent to step into the space of open access for a very long time because it has been a very contentious one. And as an organization that is a community base of both equally library providers, library systems providers, and publishers, consensus around open access has been fraught, let's put it that way. We approach this perspective not from a promotional perspective about greater, freer, cheaper open access, but rather from the perspective of if a publisher is going to choose to distribute things in open access in any form, be that an open access journal, be that in a hybrid environment, even under a restrictive license environment, the fact that you're doing that should be exposed to the community in a machine-readable way so that you can get the benefits of choosing to head down an open access direction. A bit more information is available. Here's some links. As I said, all of the slides will be posted. I also want to draw your attention to a special issue of Information Standards Quarterly, which is available open access, although not in DOAJ, but it is available open access. So this summer issue of ISQ was guest edited by Liam Earney at the JISC, and it focused on the issues of open access infrastructure. There's a number of really fantastic papers in there looking at the infrastructure. There's the DOI, you can get a copy of that. And I think with regard to, this is the last slide. With regard to this question of infrastructure takes a long time to develop. Even a relatively simple recommended practice of 2 tags has taken not quite 2 years. If we're going to build large infrastructure that we're going to have to implement to manage billions of dollars of transactions, we should start making plans now. I don't know what those plans are. Conversations that I've had with a variety of players in this space, we are not ready for a specification for APCs. However, I think it's time that we can start having a conversation about what the workflows are. What do we need to put in place? What would the system look like if we head in that direction? So NISO is going to be approaching some other organizations, potentially some funding organizations, to help organize a meeting in 2015 to explore this question of infrastructure and what we might have to put in place and how we can move in that direction, knowing that it will probably take 3 to 5 years to get that infrastructure at least in its formative stage. It will probably take that long. But I think if we don't start that process now, 3 to 5 years from now, we don't have that infrastructure, we are going to be in a very painful place. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.